My name is Anna McLeod, and I'm here today to talk to you about writing outcomes-based learning objectives. I am the Educational Objectives Specialist in the Division of Medical Education at Dalhousie University. I think I would be remiss to give a little talk about learning objectives without having some learning objectives for the presentation itself. And so my hope is that by the end of this quick sort of overarching presentation, that you will be able to write learning objectives that are outcomes-based, and that you'll be able to use Bloom's taxonomy as a guide to help you when you're engaged in that process of writing outcomes-based learning objectives. So starting from the beginning then, what is a learning objective? Just as a quick review, a learning objective is a statement that describes the sort of essential learning that a student or a learner must have achieved or demonstrated by the end of a particular learning activity, whatever that might be. As a medical school, we have been asked specifically by the Liaison Council on Medical Education to develop learning objectives that are outcomes-based. The standard ED1A states really clearly that the objectives of the educational program must be stated in outcome-based terms that allow assessment of student progress in developing the competencies that the profession and the public expect of a physician. So what does that mean for us? What are outcomes-based learning objectives? These are learning objectives that focus on the learner rather than the teacher or the topic. So this means we think about what the learner needs to know or be able to do at the end of the learning experience, rather than what we as teachers need to tell, need to teach, or rather than focusing on the sort of component parts of the content. We're always thinking about what it is that the learner needs to know. And if our outcomes-based learning objectives are really well written in accordance with these sort of principles, then ideally they will facilitate the assessment of student learning. And those are the kinds of outcomes-based learning objectives that we're working toward. So here are a couple of examples of objectives that I've pulled for us to have a look at and think about. The first one is an example of a learning objective that is written in outcomes-based terms. Essentially, it states that at the end of this unit, the learner will be able to describe the 4 principles of medical ethics. This is a good example of an outcomes-based objective because it focuses on the learner and states clearly what the learner will be able to do at the end of the given learning activity. The next example that's on the screen is an example of a non-outcomes-based objective. It's written in a way that we might more traditionally see. It states that the objective of the unit is to introduce the basic concepts of medical ethics. The two objectives are getting at the same sort of idea, but this objective is not focused on the learner, and it is not as easy to assess when a basic concept has been introduced. So when we are working from an outcomes-based perspective, it's important to keep in mind then that we're focusing on the learner and that the activity that we're describing in the objective itself is actually measurable and will guide us in our assessment of student learning. So how will we actually do this? How is it that we engage in writing learning objectives that are outcomes focused? We're proposing that we're using Bloom's taxonomy as a tool in this process. Bloom's taxonomy is a really foundational piece of educational theory, and it has been widely used by educators in many different disciplines for over 50 years now. It has undergone some revision and has been really extensively written about and talked about, but essentially Bloom's taxonomy is a foundation for creating learner-centered, outcome-oriented objectives. It's a taxonomy that ranks cognitive abilities of our learners, beginning with really simple tasks and progressing to more complex skills. And essentially, Bloom's taxonomy not only suggests the sorts of domains of learning, but also gives us appropriate and measurable verbs that we can use when we're actually writing our outcomes-based learning objectives. So let's take a look at a schematic representing Bloom's taxonomy. It can be represented lots of different ways. Sometimes it looks like a table as it's presented here. You'll see it sometimes in a pyramid format or sometimes as a wheel. But the basic idea that's consistent across all of those formats is the idea that the taxonomy represents a progression of learning. So the idea behind this schematic is that it's a progression of learning, beginning with the sort of basic or foundational cognitive skills like being able to remember and progressing to increasingly complex skills. So at a very basic foundational level, we would hope that a learner would be able to remember. The next sort of level of complexity is around understanding, being able to explain important information. At the next category of level is the idea of application, or that our learners are able to apply what they have remembered and understood in order to solve closed-ended problems. The next level of cognitive complexity is analysis, so the idea being that our learners are able to analyze based on what they have remembered, understood, and applied in order to solve more open-ended or more complicated problems. At the next level is the idea of evaluation. Our learners are able to make critical judgments based on what they've learned today. So they're able to evaluate what they have remembered, understood, applied, and analyzed. And at the very far end, the sort of most complex level of cognitive skill here is being able to create or generate new knowledge based on what has been remembered, understood, applied, analyzed, and evaluated. So what's very helpful for us in this Bloom's taxonomy when we're actually engaged in writing outcomes-based learning objectives is that Bloom suggests appropriate measurable verbs that fit with each of the categories of learning to help us think about what our learners need to be able to do at the end of a particular learning experience. It's important to think about the level that our learners are at when we're writing our learning objectives. So for example, a Med 1 learner might be in the understanding category of learning at this stage. So we would choose verbs when we're writing our outcomes-oriented learning objectives that are characteristic of that domain. Things like translate, discuss, describe, explain, the verbs that are listed underneath the understanding heading. So we're always thinking about what stage our learners are at, and we're choosing appropriate action verbs that actually fit with what we can realistically expect our learners to be able to do at the end of a particular learning activity. So if we keep in mind Bloom's taxonomy and we ask ourselves the question, what will the learner be able to do at the end of this learning activity, then we'll be able to generate outcomes-based learning objectives that are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. As a final activity, I thought we'd have a quick look at the anatomy of an outcomes-based learning objective. At the end of a particular learning activity, whatever that learning activity might be, a case, a lecture, a lab, or even an entire unit, the learner will be able to do something. And so we need to choose an appropriate action verb as described in Bloom's taxonomy. So the learner will be able to do this in a particular setting, whatever that setting might be, and to a particular standard or degree. So for an example then, at the end of this presentation as our learning activity, the learner will be able to independently write clear outcomes-based learning objectives. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact me at the contact information on your screen. Thank you.